Hello and welcome everyone. I am Joanne Weber and I will be your instructor for this introductory course in American Sign Language, which will be signed either ASL or like this. Now, before we dive into talking about the language, I want to first start by addressing identity. Some of you may already know this, but some members of the deaf community like to be identified as Big D deaf. What does this actually mean? It's an identity marker. The individual identifies as part of the signing deaf community, contributes to the maintenance of the community, and identifies with deaf culture. This person has a role in the community. In my case, I was a teacher of deaf and hard of hearing students. I work at a university as a professor and a researcher. And for decades, I have advocated for deaf rights within various levels of government. The Big D deaf has nothing to do with hearing loss. It has nothing to do with the degree of hearing you have. You as a hearing person may be curious about how much I can or cannot hear. That is of no interest to anyone in the deaf community. What is important is the individual's connection to the community and culture. So what is meant by little d deaf identifier? This is more of a medical autological label. The deaf person may prefer to speak, may identify more closely with the hearing mainstream norms, and may describe themselves as having a hearing disability. This person likely has no or very little contact with the deaf community, might seek supports from the A.G. Bell Association or Hard of Hearing associations. The actual hearing loss in those identified as little d deaf run the gamut. Mild, moderate, severe, profound. I myself have what's audiologically labeled a profound hearing loss. Since these big D deaf and little d deaf labels were introduced, the problem became apparent that many individuals consider themselves both big D deaf and little d deaf. As more students graduated from the mainstream educational system, perhaps acquiring some spoken language, perhaps able to use some residual hearing, the deaf community did not see them as deaf enough. It must be understood that the deaf community felt these labels were important toward achieving recognition of ASL as a distinct language and the deaf culture as a distinct culture. These labels were important for political purposes. Deaf scholars are now beginning to eschew the big little d deaf labels in an attempt to be more inclusive of all deaf people, regardless of their signing fluency. Some deaf leaders in Canada agree with this approach, but it is not widespread. Given this current debate, it's best to follow the wishes of the local deaf community, which in Edmonton still identifies as Big D deaf. Now I want to move on to discuss the development of deaf identity. Glickman's research identifies 4 states of cultural development of identity that pertain to both the deaf community and the hearing community. Culturally hearing individuals view deaf people as deficient, inferior, broken. Their perspective is that deaf people are disabled and require interventions to fix them. Culturally hearing people come from an audiocentric value, frame of reference, and beliefs regarding the ability to hear and use spoken language are primary. Culturally marginal individuals hold beliefs that may shift back and forth between the hearing worldview and the deaf worldview. They're not entrenched in either perspective. Immersion identity individuals fully identify as deaf. Most of their interactions and community involvement would be within the deaf community. Naturally, they carry on their daily lives in mainstream society, but their chosen associations are with other deaf people. Bicultural identity individuals are competent and comfortable in both worlds. They understand the differences and similarities of the norms and behaviors of each community and are able to successfully navigate between the two. Now we'll move on to discuss ASL in more detail. American Sign Language involves the visual modality, whereas spoken English involves the auditory modality. The challenge is for you to set that aside. Your vision is going to be doing the work of language learning. ASL is a visual spatial language. Individuals who use ASL fluently and who read and write English and perhaps speak fluently are considered to be bimodal bilinguals. As a visual spatial language, it is perfectly compatible with expressing abstract ideas. As a researcher and scholar, I have presented in ASL numerous times on complex and abstract topics, and I am in no way constrained by using ASL. It is not a code with limited functions. It is a fully evolved language capable of fulfilling the same functions of all languages, whether spoken or not. ASL uses space and movement to convey meaning. By using space and movement, I can show directionality of an object or a person. The movement and space indicate toward, away, to, from, and the subject-object relationship. For example, you to me, or some third-person relationship. Movement can also show adverbials through the speed or intensity of the motion. Multiple meanings are embedded in space and movement. Contrary to some of the misunderstandings out there, ASL is not signing an English word order. People who are signing and talking at the same time are not using ASL. ASL can only be produced when the signer's voice is off. There is no such thing as a word-to-word equivalence between languages. The same is true between ASL and English. Any given word in English does not have a single equivalent in ASL, and the reverse is true. Any given sign in ASL does not have a single equivalent in English. Beginning learners of ASL are unaccustomed to using their faces to the extent required for a signed language. Movements of eyebrows, mouth, etc. show important grammatical features that when they are not present, your signed sentence is incomprehensible. There are common English expressions such as have a nice day, which are signed in this way, but is not ASL. These English intrusions have been incorporated into the pragmatics of many deaf people's daily communication in ASL, which serves to identify their linguistic repertoires. Perhaps you'd be surprised to learn that many people think ASL is like Braille. Unfortunate, but true. Linguists have and continue to thoroughly study ASL, and it is beyond any doubt that ASL has its own phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics, just like every other language. ASL has its origins in many sign languages, but mainly from French Sign Language. Laurent Clerc was a deaf teacher at a school for the deaf in France. He was convinced to travel to America in the early 1800s to help establish the first school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. ASL evolved out of the confluence of Laurent Clerc's FSL coming in contact with students' indigenous sign languages and the sign language used on the island of Martha's Vineyard, where a whole community of hearing and deaf people use sign language to communicate with each other. American Sign Language is used primarily in Canada and the US. Quebec has a different and separate language, LSQ, or Langue des Signes Québécoise. Mexico and Brazil each have their own native sign languages. Again, ASL is used primarily in Canada and the United States. In England, while they speak English, the sign language there, British Sign Language, BSL, is nothing like ASL. The two languages have nothing in common. So while they have the same spoken language, the sign languages have no connection at all. Let's move on to talk a little bit about the deaf community. Were you aware that 90% of deaf people marry other deaf people? Deaf people have the highest rate of ethnic intermarriages than any other group. So Spanish people might marry Spanish people, but for deaf people, the ethnicity is less important than finding someone who's compatible who is deaf. Deaf people marry each other for love, the comfort of shared communication, the ability to share friends, and share a common identity and life goals. Traditionally, ASL was handed down from generation through deaf parents to deaf children, who would then attend the local deaf school, and at the school, these deaf children would pass it on to non-signing deaf students who came to the school for the deaf from hearing non-signing families. Current educational policies encourage deaf children to be placed in mainstream environments. The consequence is that deaf students are isolated in a sea of hearing students with no exposure to ASL, no contact with others like themselves, which affects their development of identity and their sense of community or belonging. This practice has had by shrinking the deaf community. The research shows that approximately 10 to 13% of deaf children are born to deaf families. A 2005 study indicated that the total number of students exposed to ASL is lower than 50%. This is why it is so devastating to lose a deaf school in a province or state, because the transmission of ASL to the next generation is disrupted. As mentioned earlier, ASL shows grammatical features through the face and head. Expressions, head movements, and eye gaze all transmit grammatical meaning. I'll demonstrate two signs that are glossed as late. They have different meanings given the facial grammar. Look at the different positions of my mouth. So the first one means you're late. You weren't here on time. The second example, where the mouth was more open, means not yet, not finished. Another example is the sign glossed as girl. Pay attention to my eyebrows. The furrowed eyebrows for the second girl point indicates a question. Was that the girl? The first with the more relaxed eyebrows was just a statement. That girl. So that's why we can't wear masks learning ASL. You'll miss too much of the grammatical features. If you're wondering where to focus your attention when talking to someone in sign language, you always watch the face. That's where the grammatical signals are. Your peripheral vision will see the signs. In this sign glossed as far, even though my hand is signing comparatively far away from my body, you shouldn't move your eye gaze to my hand. Just keep watching the face. Unlike spoken languages, where you speak one word after the other, ASL overlaps units of meaning. That can be a challenge for beginners. You'll learn to get into a new headspace where you are visually taking in multiple signals at the same time. Fingerspelling is used for specific purposes. You would fingerspell proper nouns such as names of people or places, to specify brand names, for example, to identify cars like Chev, Lexus. Fingerspelling does not replace signs. Some may think that they're able to communicate with any deaf person just by using fingerspelling, but that's not how it works. The fingerspelled alphabet can be used in artistic forms. There are very creative, what we call ABC stories. When reading fingerspelling, you should look at the signer's face. You're not looking at the hand to try to decode each individual hand shape, like C-A-T. The goal as you get better is to take in the whole visual field. It's definitely a different way to take in language. ASL has the advantage to use space to convey meaning. Utilizing the location in space, the size of the movement, eye gaze, and facial grammar, you can indicate the meaning of something very far away or something really close by. Space can be used to show the linguistic function of contrasting. By shifting the shoulders, focus changes between two things. That person is very tall. The other person is quite short. This is where Edmonton is situated relative to Saskatoon. I love chocolate, but I can't stand pop. This feature allows you to compare or contrast people, places, things, or ideas. ASL uses space to convey time concepts. Anything referring to the past tense would have a movement backwards in space. So any sign going backwards, like this sign, yesterday, indicates past tense. For present tense, signs take place in the space directly in front of your body. This is the sign for now. Anything referring to the future tense would have a movement forward in space. Tomorrow, a sign like this, with a forward movement. Let's change gears and talk about deaf cultural norms of behavior. How do you get a deaf person's attention? You can't just say their name. You can tap them on the shoulder. You can wave your hand if they are looking in your general direction, but don't overdo it. That's not cool. Obviously, if they are looking away, then there's no point in waving. You'll just look like a fool. Don't wave in a person's face. That's terribly rude. So wait until the person is looking in your general direction and wave discreetly. No antics needed. Other appropriate ways to get a deaf person's attention is to flick the light switch on and off. That cues a deaf person immediately that someone wants their attention. Or stamp your foot on the floor if it can carry vibrations. The vibration, not the sound, will be felt, and the deaf person will know someone is trying to get their attention and look to see who it is. Stamping the floor is not considered rude. If you see two people signing with each other and they are blocking your way so that you can't get to where you're going, the best thing for you to do is just pass through the space between them. That may feel rude to you, but it is not rude in deaf culture. Your walking through that space does not interfere with their conversation at all. They won't even notice you. If you pause when you reach them to excuse yourself to pass through, that's more disruptive. Unbelievably, some people actually bend down and pass between two signers. They think this is polite, but it's even more distracting. Looks kind of dumb. So either just walk through or walk around if that option is available. Let's talk a little bit about rude behaviors. What would be considered rude in the deaf community? Watching the sign conversations of deaf people is the same idea as eavesdropping. Talking or speaking to the deaf person, expecting them to hear or speech read you when you can use sign language is very inconsiderate. Physically pushing people aside so you can pass through would be considered rude. That's rude to everybody. Unlike one of the previous examples, in this scenario, it is the same for the two communities. Asking the deaf person if they can read lips is extremely rude. While you may think it's a neutral question, it's not. You're implicitly showing you want the burden of communication on the shoulders of the deaf person. They need to speech read you. That's not fair. Communication requires both parties to take responsibility. It's a common enough question, but it's irritating. I want to talk about how deaf people see the world. We are visual, very visual. So if we have to describe a person we don't know, we will use distinctive features such as their physical shape, e.g., like the heavy woman, the short man. This is not considered rude in deaf culture. It may seem rude to others, but it is not meant that way. These are neutral markers to describe people or the environment. Other examples are the bald man, the old woman, the person with the hunched back using a cane. These are unambiguous descriptions that help identify the person. Once their name is known, then they will be referred to by name. What are and are not the most effective communication strategies? Most people assume deaf people speech read. This is not the best strategy. Only 30% of sounds are visible, so speech reading puts an incredible burden on the deaf person to guess and figure out what is being said. So much is missed or lost with this strategy. Writing notes back and forth is better, but the best would be to communicate in ASL. I want to touch on some of the values held by the deaf community. Deaf people do not consider themselves disabled. They consider themselves a minority community that governs their own organizations with agency over their own lives. That agency is important to them. Within the community, they would have a wide network of contacts, resources, and supports. They do not want to be controlled by or directed by, quote, well-meaning others. The deaf community is perfectly able to take care of themselves. Another important value is being informed about the community and its members. Sharing information is important, is valued. If they don't know what's going on in the community or who's doing what, then they'll try to find out because knowing about one another's well-being is valued in the community. The deaf community functions as a collective. As a member of the community, there is an expectation that you will contribute. There is a sense of social obligation and duty to the group. You would naturally develop long-term relationships within the community. What we do not value is fixing our hearing status. Deafness is completely normal. As a collective culture, the achievements of the individual are not what's celebrated. It's a collective effort. It's through the work of the community that gains are made and celebrated. Getting my PhD was not an individual achievement. This achievement was possible only through the support of the deaf community across Canada, the support of other deaf academics, and a strong network of deaf people. I owe a great deal to the deaf community in Canada. Lastly, I want to discuss terminology. More importantly, the terminology not to use, such as deaf and dumb, deaf mute, and hearing impaired. Hearing impaired, that's a no-no. We reject these labels. You can use the terms deaf and hard of hearing. The distinction between deaf or hard of hearing status, in terms of what you actually can hear, is not important to us at all, but seems to be very important to hearing people. The key is to ask the person how they identify. Hard of hearing, big D deaf, little d deaf, and I'll close there. Thank you.